DEA raid in Las Vegas nets 3 kilograms pink cocaine and $1.2 million from University President's office.
Just after sunrise on an otherwise ordinary weekday, a routine compliance check inside a support wing of a high-level federal office set off what would become one of the most unexpected internal security investigations in recent memory. What began as a simple audit quickly escalated when inspectors discovered irregularities that suggested someone had been using their clearance in ways that didn't align with their role. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a human error, a mislabeled entry, a misplaced item. But the atmosphere shifted the moment supervisors realized the inconsistencies weren't random. They formed a pattern, subtle enough to be overlooked for months, yet intentional enough that no one could ignore the implications. Within hours, what started as a quiet internal review had grown into a full-scale inquiry that would ripple through multiple departments and reveal how easily a trusted system can be strained when even a handful of people choose the wrong path. The discovery that started everything. The turning point came when investigators opened a secure storage area connected to a senior advisor's workspace and uncovered materials that raised serious questions about how deeply certain individuals had compromised their roles. While none of the findings posed immediate physical danger, they suggested misuse of access, improper handling of resources, and connections to channels that had no legitimate reason to intersect with federal offices. The advisor at the center of the investigation offered no explanation, remaining silent throughout the initial inquiry. That silence, calm, steady, and without resistance, was unsettling not because of guilt or defiance, but because of how confidently it indicated he had expected this moment to arrive. When investigators examined his electronic records, the situation expanded from concerning to critical. Files were meticulously organized, time-stamped, and coded in ways that pointed toward a long-running pattern of misdirection woven into daily operations. The fact that this had occurred inside a respected institution made the revelation all the more alarming. The first glimpse of a deeper network, analysts reviewing the advisor's digital logs were stunned by the level of structure behind the irregularities. Rather than a casual misuse of systems, the files showed coordinated scheduling, routing documents aligned with unauthorized transactions, and a network of individuals who had quietly facilitated improper activity without drawing suspicion. The initial folder revealed more than 24 questionable transfers, each disguised among legitimate shipments and signed off through routine digital processes. Another folder listed several employees, some federal, some state level, whose roles had granted them access to scheduling systems, inventory records, or administrative databases. Most of these positions were ordinary on the surface, the type of work no one would expect to be critical in a security breach, but that unassuming nature is precisely what made the pattern possible. A third folder mapped out several residential locations that had been used as informal coordination points, chosen specifically because they blended into quiet neighborhoods where everyday life carried on undisturbed. These discoveries made one thing painfully clear: the breach wasn't accidental. It had roots deep enough to warrant an immediate nationwide response. The government moves in. With the evidence revealing a coordinated misuse of authority, federal command centers quickly shifted into a defensive posture normally reserved for protecting against external threats. Alerts went out across agencies, and investigative teams were reassigned to verify which channels had been compromised and which systems remained intact. The urgency didn't stem from fear of physical danger, but from the realization that trust, the cornerstone of federal operations, had been exploited. Agencies that typically operated independently found themselves sharing data, cross-referencing clearances, and tracing authorization trails. The priority became containment, identifying every person connected to the breach, every access point affected, and every document that needed verification. It was the kind of inter-agency mobilization rarely seen outside national emergencies. And while the public remained unaware, internal leadership understood the potential consequences of inaction. The operation that revealed the truth over the next 24 hours, coordinated teams visited several locations listed in the recovered files. Instead of armed raids or dramatic confrontations, these operations were quiet, methodical, and strictly administrative. Investigators interviewed occupants, secured electronic devices, and reviewed paperwork to determine whether each location had been knowingly involved. Many residents were confused to learn that someone had used their address without their knowledge, often through fraudulent rental agreements or misrepresented identities. What investigators found inside these homes wasn't dangerous material, but rather traces of logistical activity. Notes, schedules, outdated billing records, and indications that these residences had served as organizational hubs rather than operational ones. It became clear the network relied on blending into everyday life, using common environments to avoid drawing suspicion. By the time officials finished their inspections, they had built a clearer picture of how a small but structured group had taken advantage of gaps within the system. A system under stress. As investigators pieced together information from across multiple states, analysts in Washington worked to understand the broader pattern. When data from the interviews, documents, and digital logs was combined, the network resembled a parallel administrative structure running quietly beneath legitimate operations. The misuse of trucking companies, private businesses, and office workflows showed how easily everyday procedures could be exploited when no one expects wrongdoing to originate from within. None of these companies had criminal histories. None had been flagged in previous audits. Their only mistake was unknowingly serving as conduits for paperwork that had been manipulated before ever reaching them. The federal seals discovered on certain documents, replicas rather than true credentials, demonstrated an uncomfortable truth. Even systems built on verification can be manipulated if a trusted insider provides the appearance of legitimacy. The deeper analysts looked, the more they realized this breach had developed slowly, patiently, and quietly enough to slip under the radar for years. The internal reactions. As news of the breach spread internally, the reaction across federal offices was swift and tense. Supervisors noticed sudden absences, unexplained resignations, and unusual activity on digital systems. Workstations were wiped clean, clearance badges were abandoned, and employees who rarely interacted with security teams suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Some individuals attempted to conceal files they believed would draw suspicion, unaware that investigators had already secured backup versions. In a few cases, employees attempted to leave buildings without checking out or bypassed controlled access doors in ways that immediately raised alarms. While none of these situations involved violence, they highlighted how deeply fear and guilt can disrupt an institution once people realize an investigation is approaching. Many of those questioned later said they panicked not because they were part of the breach, but because they had seen signs of unusual behavior months earlier and failed to report it, worried their concerns would go unheard. The national response. By evening, agency leaders convened an emergency joint session to address the expanding discoveries. The meeting included directors from departments rarely seen coordinating so closely, demonstrating just how seriously the situation was being treated. They reviewed timelines, employee records, procurement documents, and clearance databases. Across departments, similar patterns emerged. Paperwork routed through unauthorized channels, outdated credentials still active in systems, and contractors with access levels that had not been evaluated in far too long. It no longer looked like a single breach. It looked like a vulnerability that had been quietly exploited by multiple individuals who recognized how unmonitored administrative corners could be used to conceal their actions. In response, leadership formed a unified task force dedicated to restoring system integrity. Its purpose was not only to find every compromised pipeline, but to rebuild trust throughout the institutions affected. The task force begins its work. The newly assembled task force immediately fanned out across federal offices nationwide. Their work focused on analyzing procurement logs, identifying outdated credentials, auditing administrative workflows, and reviewing all clearance-level changes from the past several years. They discovered forged identity records hidden inside HR systems, unapproved badge access linked to inactive employees, and shell companies that had secured small but strategic contracts. None of the findings suggested an external attack. Instead, they pointed toward the much more subtle threat of complacency. Systems had remained unchanged for too long. Processes had been inherited rather than updated. Trust had been given freely without re-evaluating whether it was still appropriate. The task force's work was not glamorous. It was painstaking, tedious, sometimes frustrating. but it was essential for reinforcing the very structure of institutional integrity. The rebuilt understanding of the network. When analysts finally overlaid all the gathered data on a consolidated map, the results were sobering. The network stretched through numerous businesses, several state offices, and many administrative departments. It had grown not through force or intimidation, but through opportunity, by watching how systems operated, identifying weak points, and slipping into the spaces where no one was looking. What made the breach concerning was not that it posed physical danger, but that it revealed how vulnerable even strong institutions can become when oversight is treated as a formality. The map displayed not a criminal empire, but a reminder of how small errors repeated across many people can accumulate into something far larger than anyone expects. The wake-up call. When the week ended, leaders across government agencies finally understood the full lesson of the incident. The most significant threats to an institution are rarely dramatic invasions from the outside. They are slow, silent erosions from within. They develop through overlooked details, unsupervised processes, and the assumption that everyone using a badge or password can be trusted without question. Yet there was also a reassuring message in the chaos. The moment the breach was discovered, thousands of employees across the country moved quickly to contain it. Analysts worked overnight. Investigators traveled state by state. Agencies that usually operate independently stood united. It was a demonstration of resilience, a reminder that although systems can be tested, they can also be repaired. This story isn't just about security lapses. It's about the strength of the response and the determination to protect the integrity of institutions that millions depend on. The road ahead. As the dust settles, the greatest lesson from this internal breach is simple. Protecting institutions is not a one-time effort, but an ongoing responsibility. It requires vigilance, updated procedures, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths before they grow into larger problems. The investigation continues, and while the most critical issues have been contained, there is still work ahead to strengthen safeguards and ensure systems cannot be misused in the same way again. The incident serves as a reminder that transparency and oversight are not obstacles. They are protections. And as agencies continue rebuilding, one message remains clear. The nation is strongest when it refuses to ignore the warning signs and chooses instead to confront them directly.